Jump.
Time's up. I gotta bounce.
Shapeshifter. If you restore the heart, you'd say, look at the definition, this girl.
You're welcome. This mission, whole ocean of bad. Maui's not spelled with a we, it's spelled job me. You're the bait.
Wait, what?
Monsters! Pick a night, babe.
Cake. I'm back.
Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
If you grew up watching Disney's Moana, then you already know why this story means so much to millions of people. It was never just another animated adventure. It was a story about finding your own identity, listening to your inner voice, and having the courage to leave everything familiar behind. Now, in 2026, Disney is bringing that world into live action. And this time the ocean, the island of Motunui, Moana herself, and the legendary demigod Maui are being presented in a completely different way. The big question is whether this new version can capture the same magic that made the original so memorable, or whether it will simply feel like another Disney remake. The new movie is directed by Thomas Kail, the filmmaker known for bringing Hamilton to the screen. While Catherine Logaya takes on the role of Moana and Dwayne Johnson returns as Maui, that last part is especially interesting because Johnson originally voiced Maui in the animated film. So audiences are not watching a completely new interpretation of the character. Instead, they are seeing him physically step into the world that helped make the character famous in the first place. Disney has also brought together a largely Pacific cast, with John Tui, Frankie Adams, and Rena Owen among the principal cast members. At the center of the story is Moana, a young woman from the island of Motunui who has always felt an unusual connection to the ocean. Her people depend on their island, their traditions, and the life they have built there. But Moana has never been completely comfortable with the idea of staying within the limits placed in front of her. There is something inside her that keeps pulling her toward the horizon. She wants to understand what is beyond the reef, even though her responsibilities and her family constantly remind her that the ocean is dangerous. That conflict is what makes Moana such an interesting character. She is not trying to become a hero simply because she wants fame or power. She is trying to understand who she really is. Her journey begins with a simple feeling that there has to be something more beyond the world she knows. But once she finally gets the opportunity to travel across the ocean, she discovers that the journey is much bigger and much more dangerous than she ever imagined. One of the most important parts of the movie is Moana's relationship with her family and her connection to Motunui. Her people are not simply background characters. They represent everything Moana is afraid of losing. The island is her home, and leaving it means taking a risk that could affect everyone she loves. That makes her decision to sail beyond the reef much more meaningful because she isn't simply running away from home. She is taking responsibility for the future of the people who depend on her. And then there is Maui. When Moana encounters Maui, the entire energy of the story changes. Maui is confident, loud, unpredictable, and completely convinced that he is the greatest person to ever sail across the ocean. But underneath all that confidence is a character with his own insecurities. He wants to be remembered as a hero, and he has spent much of his life trying to prove that he deserves the admiration of others. Dwayne Johnson's return as Maui is one of the biggest talking points surrounding the movie. This time, however, audiences get to see him physically perform the character rather than simply providing the voice. Disney's trailers and promotional material have emphasized the chemistry between Johnson's Maui and Logaia's Moana, and that relationship remains one of the biggest reasons audiences are interested in seeing this version. The interesting thing about Moana and Maui is that they are almost complete opposites. Moana is still discovering herself, while Maui believes he already knows exactly who he is. Moana wants to prove that she can become a leader, while Maui wants everyone else to believe that he has always been one. Their personalities constantly clash, and that creates many of the lighter moments in the story. But beneath the humor, their relationship slowly becomes something more meaningful. They begin as two people who need each other for completely different reasons. Moana needs Maui's knowledge and experience, while Maui needs Moana's determination. Neither one of them can complete the journey alone. The ocean itself also plays a huge role in this story. It is not simply a location where the characters travel. In Moana's world, the ocean almost feels like another character. It responds to Moana, guides her, challenges her, and repeatedly pushes her toward the path she is supposed to follow. That connection becomes even more interesting in live action because Disney has the opportunity to show the ocean on a much larger cinematic scale. The original animation could create almost anything visually, but live action has to make that fantasy world feel physically real. The trailers have already shown audiences huge ocean environments, practical locations, boats, costumes, and digitally created elements designed to make Motunui feel like a living place rather than an animated backdrop. And this is where the movie starts to separate itself from a simple copy of the original. The basic story may be familiar, but the presentation is different. Seeing Moana standing on an actual beach, climbing onto a real-looking boat, and facing the enormous Pacific Ocean gives some of these familiar moments a completely different feeling. Of course, fans are going to compare everything with the animated version. That is unavoidable. The original movie became one of Disney's biggest modern animated successes, and its songs became a huge part of popular culture. So when a live-action version arrives, audiences are naturally going to ask whether the new performances can match the emotional impact of the originals. The music is therefore another major part of the movie. Songs such as How Far I'll Go are closely connected to Moana's identity, and hearing these familiar songs in a live-action environment gives them a different emotional weight. Disney has made the music and performances a major part of the promotional campaign, showing that the movie is not trying to abandon the musical identity that made the original so popular. The trailers also give us a pretty clear idea of what Disney wants this movie to feel like. Rather than presenting it as a completely new adventure, the footage focuses heavily on the recognizable story, characters, locations, music, and emotional moments that audiences already know. But the scale has been increased. The ocean looks bigger, the environments feel more physical, and the performances are designed to make the characters feel like real people living inside this world. The official trailer campaign began building anticipation months before release, with Disney releasing a teaser, followed by a full trailer and later additional promotional footage. By June, Disney was also promoting an all-new trailer featuring Catherine Lagaya, Dwayne Johnson, and Jermaine Clement returning as Tamatoa. Tamatoa is another character that longtime fans will immediately recognize. The giant crab may not be the emotional center of the story, but he adds a completely different flavor to the adventure. Jermaine Clement, who voiced Tamatoa in the animated movie, returns to the character in the new production, giving fans another connection between the original and the live-action version. As the story continues, Moana's journey becomes less about proving that she can sail and more about proving that she can make difficult choices. The ocean can take her somewhere, Maui can teach her things, and her ancestors can inspire her, but eventually Moana has to make decisions for herself. That is really the heart of the story. Moana is not waiting for someone to tell her who she should become. She is trying to discover that answer on her own, and that is why the character has remained so popular. She doesn't become powerful because someone gives her a crown. She becomes powerful because she learns to trust herself. The 2026 film also arrives at an interesting moment for Disney. The studio has spent years turning beloved animated stories into live-action films. But Moana presents a different challenge because the original is still relatively recent compared with some of Disney's older classics. That means audiences remember the animated version extremely well. There is no huge gap between generations here. Many people watching this movie grew up with the original. So Disney has a difficult balance to maintain. The film needs to feel familiar enough that longtime fans recognize the story they love, but different enough that audiences have a reason to watch it again. And that is probably the biggest question surrounding the entire project. Can this live-action Moana create its own identity? The answer depends heavily on the performances, the chemistry between Moana and Maui, the visual effects, and whether the emotional moments feel genuine rather than simply recreated shot for shot. If those elements work together, the movie has the potential to introduce Moana's story to an entirely new audience while giving longtime fans another way to experience it. But there is still much more to discuss, especially when it comes to the characters, the visual transformation of Motunui, the returning musical moments, and the differences between this production and the animated original. And once we look closer at those details, the real ambition behind Disney's 2026 version becomes much easier to understand. One of the most interesting things about this new version is that Disney is not only recreating a familiar story, it is attempting to make the world of Moana feel physically believable. That means the island, the ocean, the boats, the costumes, and even the smallest details of Motunui have to work together. In animation, filmmakers can create a fantasy world without worrying about whether something exists in the real world. In live action, everything has to feel like it belongs there. That challenge becomes especially important with the ocean. The original movie made the sea feel magical from the very beginning, and the live-action version needs to preserve that feeling without making everything look artificial. The trailers show that Disney has focused heavily on the scale of the environment, allowing the ocean to become something that feels enormous compared with Moana herself. Then there is Catherine Lagaia. For a new actor taking over such an iconic role, the pressure is enormous. Audiences already have a strong emotional connection with animated Moana, so simply looking the part is not enough. The performance has to communicate curiosity, determination, fear, humor, and vulnerability. Moana has to feel like someone who is discovering her strength while the audience discovers the world alongside her. That is why the casting of Lagaia is such an important part of the movie. Disney has described her as the determined wayfinder at the center of this adventure, and her performance carries much of the emotional responsibility of the film. Dwayne Johnson has a completely different challenge. He already knows Maui extremely well because he voiced the character in the animated film. But playing Maui physically means he has to bring the character's enormous personality into a live-action performance. Maui is supposed to be larger than life, and Johnson naturally has the screen presence to do that. The biggest advantage is that audiences already know the chemistry between Maui and Moana. Their relationship has always been one of the strongest parts of the story because neither character is perfect. They argue, they misunderstand each other, and they sometimes make terrible decisions. But gradually, they begin to trust one another. That friendship is important because the movie is ultimately not about one person saving everyone else. It is about two very different people learning that they are stronger when they work together. The story also continues to explore Moana's relationship with her ancestors and the traditions of her people. Her journey is connected to a larger history, one that stretches far beyond her own lifetime. The ocean is calling her, but she is also responding to the legacy of those who came before her. This gives the adventure a deeper emotional layer. Moana isn't simply asking, "Where can I go?" She is also asking, "Who are my people? And who am I supposed to become?" That question is what separates Moana from a typical adventure hero. A typical hero might leave home because they want excitement. Moana leaves because something inside her tells her that she has a responsibility to discover what lies beyond the reef. She is afraid, but she goes anyway. And that is an important distinction. Courage isn't about having no fear. It's about moving forward even when you're scared. The movie's promotional campaign has repeatedly highlighted that idea. Disney's trailers focus on Moana's connection to the ocean, her journey beyond the reef, and her partnership with Maui. The official material also emphasizes the film's Pacific Island setting and the collaboration of Pacific talent behind the production. Another major returning element is the music. For many fans, Moana is inseparable from its soundtrack. The songs aren't just entertainment between scenes. They help explain what the characters are feeling. How Far I'll Go, in particular, is essentially Moana's inner voice turned into a song. That makes the live-action performance of the song especially important. The challenge is not simply to sing it correctly. The performer has to make the audience believe that these words are coming directly from Moana's heart. The same applies to Maui's musical moments. His larger-than-life personality naturally fits the musical side of the story. And Jermaine Clement's return as Tamato adds another familiar voice to the movie. Visually, the movie also has an opportunity to make familiar moments feel new. A scene that looked beautiful in animation can suddenly feel much more immediate when it is presented with real locations. Physical performances, practical costumes, and cinematic lighting. This is probably where fans will have the strongest reactions. Some viewers will love seeing their favorite characters brought into the real world, while others may feel that the animated version had a unique visual style that cannot really be replaced. And honestly, both reactions are understandable. The original Moana was designed specifically for animation. Its colors, movement, expressions, and impossible environments were part of its identity. The live-action version cannot simply reproduce all of that exactly. Instead, it has to translate the spirit of that world into something that feels believable. That is a much harder task than it sounds. The release strategy also shows how much confidence Disney has in the movie. The film was released exclusively in theaters on July 10, 2026 in the United States, giving it a major summer theatrical position. Disney's official page lists a runtime of approximately 1 hour and 55 minutes and describes it as an action-adventure live-action reimagining. International release dates vary by market, but the movie was positioned as one of Disney's major theatrical releases of the summer. By early July, the studio had already held a world premiere and released additional footage. giving audiences a closer look at the cast and the finished production. The trailer itself is also worth discussing because it tells us something about Disney's approach. Instead of hiding the familiar story, the marketing openly embraces it. We see Moana, Maui, the ocean, the island, and several recognizable elements from the animated film. The goal appears to be less about surprising audiences with a completely different story and more about asking a simple question: what would Moana look like if this world actually existed? And that question is probably the main reason people are interested. For longtime fans, this movie is a chance to revisit a story they already love. For younger audiences, it can be their first experience with Moana. And for people who were never particularly interested in the animated film, the live-action format may give them a reason to finally watch it. But there is another factor that makes this adaptation particularly meaningful: representation. Moana's world is deeply connected to Pacific Island culture, and Disney has emphasized collaboration with Pacific talent throughout the production. That matters because the setting isn't simply being used as an exotic background. The people, traditions, movement, music, and environment are all part of the identity of the story. Ultimately, though, the success of the movie will come down to something much simpler. Does Moana still make us care? Does her decision to leave home still feel emotional? Does her relationship with Maui still make us laugh? Does the ocean still feel mysterious? Does the music still hit with the same emotional power? And most importantly, does Moana still feel like a character who is discovering herself rather than simply following a script? If the answer to those questions is yes, then Disney may have succeeded in doing what a remake is supposed to do. It doesn't need to replace the original. It simply needs to give audiences another way to experience the story. And that brings us back to the biggest misunderstanding surrounding this movie. Despite people online sometimes calling it Moana 3, the 2026 project is officially a live-action reimagining of the original Moana story, not a third animated sequel. Disney's official materials identify it simply as Moana, so if you're expecting a completely new Moana adventure after the events of the animated sequel, that's not what this particular movie is. Instead, you're getting the beginning of Moana's journey again, but this time with real actors, a new visual presentation, and a much more physically grounded version of the world. And perhaps that is what makes this project so fascinating. We already know where the journey begins. We know the characters, we know the songs, we know the emotional destination. Yet there is still something exciting about seeing that familiar ocean open up in an entirely new way. For fans of Moana, this isn't necessarily about choosing between animation and live action. It's about seeing whether the heart of the story survives the transformation, because beneath the costumes, visual effects, songs, giant ocean shots, and famous characters, Moana has always been about one simple idea. Sometimes the hardest journey is not finding a new place, but finding the courage to become the person you were meant to be, and that message is exactly why, even after all these years, audiences are still willing to sail back to Motunui. The moment Moana decides to leave Motunui, the adventure stops being a dream and becomes a real test of everything she has ever believed about herself. Until this point, the ocean has always represented something mysterious and forbidden, something her father warned her to stay away from. But now she has no choice except to face it. Her people are in danger. And the future of Motunui depends on whether she can understand the ancient forces threatening their way of life. What makes this part of Moana's journey so powerful is that she doesn't suddenly become fearless. She is still the same young woman who has doubts about herself. The difference is that she finally understands that being afraid doesn't mean she has to turn back. She takes the first real step toward becoming the leader her people need. The live-action version has the opportunity to make that departure feel much more physical. Instead of watching an animated character push a canoe into the water, audiences can actually feel the scale of the ocean around her. The waves, wind, wooden boat, and enormous horizon all help create the impression that Moana is entering a world that is far larger than anything she has experienced before. And then, of course, she needs Maui. Maui is not exactly excited about becoming Moana's partner. He has his own agenda, his own ego, and his own complicated relationship with the people who remember him as a legendary hero. When Moana finds him, she quickly discovers that having a demigod on your side doesn't necessarily make the journey easier. In some ways, it makes everything even more chaotic. That contrast between Moana and Maui remains one of the funniest elements of the story. Moana is focused on the mission, while Maui is constantly trying to remind everyone that he is the greatest hero imaginable. He has confidence for days, but beneath that confidence is a character who is deeply concerned about how others see him. This is where Dwayne Johnson's performance becomes particularly important. He already knows Maui's personality, but live action gives him a chance to communicate that personality through facial expressions, movement, physical comedy, and interaction with the environment. The official cast information confirms that Johnson returns as Maui alongside Catherine Lagaaya as Moana. Their relationship doesn't become perfect overnight. In fact, that's what makes it enjoyable. They annoy each other. They disagree about what should happen next. They sometimes make decisions without thinking about the consequences, but every challenge forces them to understand each other a little more. Moana begins to realize that Maui isn't simply the arrogant demigod he pretends to be. Maui begins to understand that Moana isn't just an inexperienced teenager who needs someone to protect her. She has courage, determination, and something even more important, the ability to keep going when everyone else would give up. That becomes crucial as the journey becomes more dangerous. The world outside Motunui is filled with forces that Moana cannot control. The ocean can help her, but it can also turn against her. The creatures they encounter are unpredictable, and every new destination brings another problem. The further Moana travels, the more she realizes that this isn't going to be a simple mission with an easy solution. The original animated movie established this structure beautifully, and the live-action version appears determined to preserve the same adventurous spirit. Disney's official description still centers on Moana, answering the ocean's call and traveling beyond the reef, with Maui to restore prosperity to her people. But there is something else happening beneath the adventure. Moana is slowly separating herself from the expectations placed on her. Her father wants her to become the leader of Motunui. He believes that protecting the island means staying close to home and following the traditions that have kept their people safe. From his perspective, the ocean represents danger. For Moana, however, the ocean represents possibility. Neither of them is completely wrong. That is why their conflict works. Chief Tui isn't simply trying to control his daughter because he doesn't understand her. He is afraid of losing her. His fear comes from love, even though Moana experiences it as a limitation. This emotional conflict gives the story a much stronger foundation than a simple adventure movie. Moana's greatest challenge isn't necessarily defeating a monster or surviving a storm. It's convincing herself that she can make difficult decisions without betraying the people she loves. And that is something many viewers can relate to. There comes a point in life when you realize that following your own path can disappoint people who genuinely care about you. Moana's journey captures that feeling in a way that is accessible to almost everyone. Another important character in that emotional journey is Grandma Tala. She understands Moana in a way that few other people do. Instead of telling her to ignore the ocean, Tala encourages her to listen to what she feels inside. Her presence gives Moana the confidence to believe that her curiosity isn't a weakness. Rena Owen plays Grandma Tala in the live-action movie, while John Tui plays Chief Tui and Frankie Adams plays Sina. Disney has identified all three as key members of the live-action cast. The casting also gives the family dynamic a more grounded feeling. These characters aren't simply there to explain the plot. They represent different sides of Moana's identity. Her father represents responsibility. Her mother represents support and understanding. Her grandmother represents tradition, wisdom, and the freedom to follow your instincts. Moana is caught between all of these influences. And eventually, she has to decide which voice to follow. The trailer campaign gives us plenty of hints about how Disney is approaching these emotional moments. The official trailer was released in March 2026, followed later by additional promotional material and a final trailer. Disney's official movie page currently lists the official trailer, final trailer, and several additional featurettes and clips. The final trailer is particularly important because it gives audiences a much clearer look at the relationship between Moana and Maui. It also emphasizes the scale of the adventure and the familiar music that made the original so popular. Disney's promotional campaign has clearly positioned the movie as both a visual spectacle and a musical adventure. And then there is Tamatoa. If Moana and Maui are the emotional center of the adventure, Tamatoa is one of the characters who brings pure chaos into the story. The giant crab is obsessed with shiny objects and loves showing off. In the animated film, Jermaine Clement's performance gave Tamatoa a bizarre combination of humor, confidence, and ridiculousness. The live-action production brings Clement back for the character, making him one of the rare performers connected directly to the original movie. Disney confirmed his return as Tamatoa during the film's promotional campaign. That kind of continuity is clever because longtime fans immediately recognize the voice and personality, while the new visual presentation gives the character a completely different appearance. The same idea applies throughout the movie. Disney isn't trying to erase what audiences remember. Instead, the studio is taking familiar characters and asking what happens when they exist in a physical world. That approach can be risky, but it also creates some of the movie's most interesting possibilities. Imagine the first time Moana encounters the enormous ocean in live action. Imagine Maui appearing in front of her after all the stories she has heard about him. Imagine the scale of the island, the boats, the storms, and the creatures surrounding them. Those moments don't need to be completely new to feel exciting. Sometimes seeing something familiar in a new form is enough. The film's visual identity is also connected to its Pacific setting. Disney has emphasized the involvement of Pacific talent, including performers and creatives connected to the culture represented in the story. That matters because Motunui is more than a fictional island. It is the foundation of Moana's identity, and the movie needs the environment to feel authentic rather than simply decorative. The music plays a similar role. Songs such as How Far I'll Go have become inseparable from Moana's character. The song expresses something that Moana struggles to say directly. She loves her home, but she feels that she is meant to discover something beyond it. The live-action version also includes an original song titled Along the Way, written by Lin-Manuel Miranda and performed by Ali Carvalho, Catherine Lagaia, and Dwayne Johnson. That addition is interesting because it gives the new film something that the original didn't have. Even though the basic story is familiar, the new song gives the live-action production a small piece of its own identity. And that's probably what this entire movie needs. It doesn't need to convince audiences that the original never existed. It needs to prove that there is still something worth discovering in this story. Because at the end of the day, Moana isn't remembered because of one particular visual effect or one particular scene. People remember it because of how the story made them feel. It made audiences believe that being different wasn't something to be ashamed of. It made people believe that questioning tradition didn't automatically mean disrespecting your family. And most importantly, it showed that sometimes the person who feels lost is actually the person who is closest to discovering their true purpose. That is the emotional foundation the 2026 movie has to protect. The 2026 movie has to protect. By the time Moana's journey truly begins, she has already crossed the most difficult barrier of all, the fear of leaving everything she knows behind. But the ocean doesn't make the journey easy just because she has finally found the courage to sail. In fact, the moment she moves farther away from Motunui, the real challenges begin. Every wave reminds her that she is no longer protected by the familiar world she grew up in. That is what makes the ocean such an important part of Moana's story. It represents freedom, but freedom comes with uncertainty. At home, Moana knows exactly who she is supposed to be. She knows her responsibilities, her family expects certain things from her, and the people of Motunui already have an idea of what her future should look like. Out on the water, all of those expectations begin to disappear. For the first time, Moana has to make decisions without someone standing beside her telling her what to do. And that is where her relationship with Maui becomes even more important. Maui may be incredibly powerful, but power doesn't automatically make someone a good teacher. His first instinct is usually to take control of a situation, especially when he thinks Moana is making a mistake. He has spent centuries believing that his strength and legendary reputation are enough to solve almost any problem. Moana slowly proves him wrong. She doesn't have the same physical strength as Maui, and she doesn't possess supernatural abilities. What she does have is persistence. When something goes wrong, she keeps trying. When Maui refuses to help, she finds another way forward. And when the ocean becomes dangerous, she doesn't simply surrender. That difference between them creates a fascinating balance. Maui has experience without humility, while Moana has determination without experience. Together, they gradually fill the gaps in each other's personalities. Maui teaches Moana how to survive in a world that she has never experienced before. Moana reminds Maui that being a hero isn't about how many people remember your name. It's about what you are willing to do when nobody is watching. This becomes particularly important when Maui's past begins to catch up with him. The legends surrounding Maui make him appear almost invincible. But his history is much more complicated. He has always wanted to be loved and remembered. His incredible abilities are partly connected to that desire. He wants people to believe that he matters. Moana slowly sees the insecurity behind the confidence, and once she does, their relationship changes. She stops seeing Maui as a legendary figure who is supposed to save her, and she starts seeing him as a person who also needs to grow. That is one of the strongest messages in the story. Heroes don't always know what they are doing. Sometimes the person who looks the strongest in the room is carrying the biggest insecurities. The live-action format gives Dwayne Johnson the opportunity to explore that side of Maui through performance rather than voice alone. His physical presence naturally makes the character feel larger than life, but the emotional scenes require something different. Maui has to be funny without becoming a joke, confident without becoming unbearable, and vulnerable without losing the larger-than-life personality audiences recognize. That balance is difficult, but it is also one of the reasons the character remains so memorable. Meanwhile, Moana continues to grow into her own identity. One of the most important things about her character is that she doesn't suddenly become a completely different person. Her transformation happens gradually. Every challenge adds something. Every mistake teaches her something. Every moment of fear forces her to understand herself a little better. This makes the journey feel believable. She doesn't wake up one morning and suddenly become the perfect leader. She becomes a leader by making mistakes and learning how to recover from them. That idea is especially important because Moana's ultimate responsibility is not simply to save herself. Her decisions affect her entire community. Motunui depends on her. Her family depends on her. And eventually, she realizes that the future of her people may depend on her willingness to challenge the limits that have been placed around them. That creates an interesting contradiction. Moana wants to protect her home, but protecting her home requires her to leave it. She wants to honor her family, but honoring their legacy requires her to question some of the things they believe. She wants to become a leader, but becoming a leader means accepting that she cannot always make everyone happy. Those are difficult lessons for anyone, and they are what make the story much deeper than a simple Disney adventure. Another thing that becomes more important as the story develops is Moana's connection with her grandmother. Grandma Tala has always understood that Moana's curiosity isn't something that should be suppressed. She sees the ocean differently. Where other people see danger, she sees a connection to their history. That perspective gives Moana something she desperately needs: permission to trust herself. Sometimes the biggest difference between confidence and insecurity is simply having one person who believes in you before you believe in yourself. For Moana, that person is Tala. Her grandmother doesn't promise that the journey will be safe. She doesn't pretend that Moana won't fail. Instead, she encourages her to understand that failure is part of discovering who she is. That message follows Moana throughout the adventure, and when things begin to go wrong, she remembers the people who believed in her. The danger also becomes more intense as Moana and Maui move deeper into the world beyond Motunui. The journey isn't simply a straight line from one island to another. There are obstacles, unexpected encounters, and moments when their plan completely falls apart. That unpredictability is important because it prevents the story from feeling like a simple checklist of locations. Every new place forces Moana to learn something. Every new enemy exposes another weakness. Every victory creates another problem. And slowly, the audience starts to realize that the real enemy isn't always something they can physically fight. Sometimes the real enemy is fear. Sometimes it is pride. Sometimes it is the belief that you are not capable of doing something simply because nobody has done it before. That is why Moana's journey feels so universal. You don't have to live on a Pacific island or sail across an enormous ocean to understand what she is experiencing. Everyone reaches moments where the future is uncertain, and the safe option is to stay exactly where they are. Moana chooses the uncertain path, and that choice changes everything. The live-action movie also gives Disney an opportunity to make the cultural elements of the story more visible. The island community, traditional clothing, boats, music, family relationships, and connection to the ocean all contribute to the identity of Motunui. Disney has emphasized Pacific representation throughout the production, with the cast and creative team helping bring those elements into the live-action world. The Walt Disney Company.com. This matters because Moana's story isn't set in an empty fantasy world. Her identity is connected to her community. The island has its own history, the people have their own traditions, and Moana's journey is ultimately about reconnecting with that history rather than abandoning it. That's an important distinction. She doesn't leave Motunui because she hates her home. She leaves because she loves it enough to find a way to protect it. And that changes the meaning of the entire adventure. When Mona looks back toward the island, she isn't thinking about escaping anymore. She is thinking about returning with something valuable. Knowledge, confidence, and a new understanding of what her people are capable of becoming. This is also where the movie's emotional relationship between Mona and Maui becomes stronger. At the beginning, Maui sees Mona as a problem he has been forced to deal with. Moana sees Maui as an arrogant demigod who may be useful but is incredibly frustrating. Eventually, they begin to respect each other, not because they suddenly stop arguing, but because they start understanding why the other person behaves the way they do. That kind of relationship is much more interesting than an instant friendship. Trust has to be earned, and in this story, it is earned through action. Maui eventually learns that Mona isn't someone who needs to be protected from every danger. Sometimes the best thing he can do is stand beside her and let her make her own decisions. Mona learns that asking for help doesn't make her weak. That is another important lesson. Being independent doesn't mean doing everything alone. Sometimes strength means knowing when someone else can help you, and this is where their partnership becomes truly meaningful. They are no longer simply traveling toward the same destination. They are helping each other become better versions of themselves. The movie's trailer campaign has repeatedly highlighted this partnership, especially in the later promotional material leading toward the theatrical release. Disney's official material presents Mona and Maui at the center of the adventure, while also showcasing the returning characters and the larger world surrounding them. Movies.disney.com. The visual scale also becomes more important during these moments. Live action allows the filmmakers to create a sense of physical danger that can feel different from animation. When a massive wave rises above the boat or the characters stand against an enormous landscape, the audience can feel how small they are compared with the world around them. And that contrast is perfect for Mona's character. She is one person facing problems that seem much bigger than she is. By this point, Mona has already changed in ways that she could never have imagined when she first stood on the shore of Motunui. She is still the same person at heart, but now she understands the ocean, her responsibilities, and herself much better. What once felt like an impossible journey has become something she knows she has to complete. But the further she travels, the more she realizes that courage alone isn't enough. There are moments when even the strongest determination can be shaken, and that is exactly what happens when the journey begins to push both Mona and Maui beyond their comfort zones. Maui has always relied on his reputation. Whenever things become difficult, his instinct is to remind everyone that he is a demigod. He believes his strength, his magical fishhook, and his legendary history should be enough to solve almost any problem. But the journey keeps showing him that being powerful doesn't mean being in control. Mona, meanwhile, is learning almost the opposite lesson. She begins the story believing that she needs Maui because he knows the ocean and understands the dangers ahead. But as the adventure continues, she becomes more confident in her own instincts. She doesn't stop listening to Maui, but she no longer blindly follows him. That change creates some tension between them. Maui isn't used to someone questioning him. Mona isn't willing to simply accept every decision he makes. And when two strong personalities start disagreeing, the journey becomes much more complicated. But those disagreements are actually important because they force both characters to grow. If Mona simply followed Maui from one location to another, she wouldn't really be developing into the leader she is supposed to become. And if Maui never had to question his own choices, he would remain the same arrogant demigod we met at the beginning. Their arguments therefore serve a bigger purpose. Every disagreement teaches them something, every mistake brings them closer, and every moment when one of them has to rely on the other strengthens their partnership. For Mona, one of the biggest lessons is that leadership isn't about having all the answers. A leader doesn't always know what will happen next. A leader doesn't always make the right decision. Sometimes leadership simply means being willing to make a decision when everyone else is too afraid to act. That is exactly what Mona begins to understand. She may not know what is waiting beyond the horizon, but she knows that staying still isn't an option. Her people need a future, and finding that future means continuing forward. The ocean becomes a reflection of that uncertainty. It can be calm one moment and violent the next. It can carry Mona toward her destination, but it can also force her to change direction. That unpredictability mirrors her own emotional journey. She wants certainty. She wants to know that her decisions will work. She wants to know that she can protect everyone she loves. But the ocean doesn't give her those guarantees. Instead, it teaches her to adapt. That is one of the biggest differences between someone who simply follows a map and someone who becomes a true wayfinder. A map tells you where you are. A wayfinder understands how to continue when the map isn't enough. Moana is slowly becoming that kind of person. Her relationship with Maui also reaches a more mature stage. They still joke with each other, and Maui still has plenty of ego, but there is now genuine trust between them. Moana knows that Maui will fight for her. Maui knows that Moana won't abandon him when things become difficult. That trust is tested when the journey becomes more dangerous. The stakes are no longer personal. Everything they are doing is connected to the future of Motunui. If they fail, Moana may return home without the answers her people need. And if she succeeds, she may completely change how her community sees the world. That is a huge responsibility for someone so young. But the story never treats Moana as someone who magically becomes an adult overnight. She still makes emotional decisions. She still gets frustrated. She still becomes overwhelmed. What changes is the way she responds to those emotions. Instead of letting fear control her, she learns to acknowledge it and continue anyway. That's what makes her growth feel real. Another important part of the adventure is the presence of Maui's magical abilities. His fishhook is more than a weapon. It represents his identity and his connection to the power that made him legendary. But power can be dangerous when someone becomes too dependent on it. Maui's relationship with the fishhook reflects his relationship with his own identity. When he feels powerful, he feels worthy. When he loses control, he begins to question whether he is still the hero everyone believes him to be. Moana slowly helps him understand that his value doesn't come from the fishhook. It comes from the choices he makes. That is a lesson Maui desperately needs. For someone who has spent so much of his life seeking approval, learning that he doesn't have to constantly prove himself is a major step forward. And in a strange way, Moana needs to learn the same thing. She doesn't have to prove herself by becoming exactly what her father expects. She doesn't have to prove herself by becoming the greatest wayfinder ever. She simply has to become the best version of herself. That is the real meaning behind her journey. As the adventure continues, the movie also gives more space to the world surrounding Moana and Maui. The ocean isn't empty. It is filled with creatures, islands, legends, and dangers that make the world feel much larger than Motunui. This is one area where the live-action format can create some impressive cinematic moments. The scale of the environments is completely different when the characters are standing inside a physical-looking world. A huge cave feels larger. A storm feels more threatening. A giant creature can feel genuinely intimidating. At the same time, Disney has to maintain the sense of wonder that made the original special. If everything becomes too realistic, the magic disappears. If everything looks too artificial, the audience stops believing in the world. The challenge is finding the middle ground. The trailers suggest that the production is leaning heavily into large-scale adventure while keeping the colorful fantasy elements that audiences associate with Moana. Disney has released multiple trailers and promotional videos leading up to the July 10, 2026 theatrical release. Movies.disney.com. Another important element is the emotional connection between Moana and her mother, Sina. Sina doesn't have the same obvious conflict with Moana that Chief Tui does, but her support is still important. She understands that Moana is struggling with the expectations surrounding her. As a mother, she wants her daughter to be safe, but she also knows that protecting someone doesn't mean preventing them from taking risks. Sometimes love means allowing someone to walk into an uncertain future because you know they have to discover their own path. That idea runs throughout the entire story. Everyone around Moana wants something for her. Her father wants her to become a strong leader of Motunui. Her mother wants her to be safe. Her grandmother wants her to follow her heart. Maui wants her to survive long enough to finish the mission. And Moana has to figure out what she wants for herself. That's a lot of pressure. But eventually, she realizes that all of these expectations can exist at the same time. She can love her family without becoming trapped by their fears. She can respect tradition without being afraid of change. She can become a leader without losing the person she already is. That realization is what truly separates the beginning of her journey from where she is now. She is no longer asking whether she belongs on the ocean. She knows she does. Now she has to decide what kind of wayfinder she wants to become. And that question becomes even more important when the adventure begins moving toward its most dangerous stage, because every journey eventually reaches a point where there is no easy way back. Moana has crossed that point. The island is far behind her. The problems are getting bigger. Maui's past is becoming more important. And the forces standing between Moana and her goal are becoming harder to overcome. At this stage, there is no guarantee that courage will be enough. There is no guarantee that Maui's powers will be enough. And there is certainly no guarantee that the ocean will save them. For the first time, Moana has to prepare herself for the possibility that she may fail. That fear is what makes the next stage of her journey so important, because real courage isn't tested when everything is going well. It's tested when you have every reason to believe that you're going to lose. Moana has already proven that she can leave home. She has already proven that she can face the ocean. She has already proven that she can stand beside Maui. Now she has to prove something much harder. She has to believe in herself when there is no obvious reason to believe that everything will work out. And as the journey moves toward its biggest confrontation, Moana begins to understand that the answer she has been searching for may have been connected to her from the very beginning. The ocean didn't choose her because she was the strongest. It chose her because she was willing to listen. And that may be the most important thing Moana has learned throughout the entire adventure. Strength can break things. Power can control things. But understanding can change everything. And now, with the final stages of her journey approaching, Moana is going to need every lesson she has learned if she wants to bring her people the future they deserve. The closer Moana gets to the end of her journey, the more she realizes that the real challenge was never simply reaching a particular destination. The ocean has taken her far from Motunui, introduced her to Maui, tested her courage, and forced her to question almost everything she thought she knew. But now, every lesson she has learned is about to be tested at the same time. At the beginning of the story, Moana believed that becoming a leader meant protecting her people by staying close to them. She thought the safest choice was always the responsible choice. But the journey has shown her that sometimes protecting the people you love requires you to take the biggest risk of your life. That realization changes the way she sees herself. She is no longer simply the daughter of Chief Tui. She is no longer the girl standing at the edge of the reef wondering what might be beyond it. She is becoming someone capable of making decisions for herself and for the people who trust her. But there is still one major problem. Maui. For all the progress he has made, Maui is still carrying the weight of his past. His confidence hides a fear that he might not be as important as everyone thinks. His legendary status has become part of his identity, and losing that status would mean confronting a much deeper insecurity. Moana begins to understand this. Instead of treating Maui like a perfect hero, she starts treating him like a person. And sometimes that's exactly what Maui needs. Someone who isn't impressed by the legend. Someone who sees the person underneath it. Their friendship becomes stronger because neither one is trying to pretend anymore. Maui can admit when he is afraid. Moana can admit when she doesn't know what to do. And once they stop pretending that they have all the answers, they become much more effective as a team. This is also where the live-action version can give these characters more emotional depth. In animation, the expressions and movement can be exaggerated to communicate emotions instantly. In live action, the actors have to create those moments through performance. For Catherine Lagaoya, that means allowing Moana's confidence and vulnerability to exist at the same time. For Dwayne Johnson, it means letting Maui's humor gradually reveal the insecurity underneath. That balance is especially important during the moments when the mission begins to feel impossible. There are times when Moana wonders whether she has made a terrible mistake. She left home. She put herself in danger. She dragged Maui into situations neither of them fully understood. And now, if she fails, she won't simply disappoint herself. She will have to return to Motunui knowing that she couldn't save the future she believed in. That fear becomes one of the biggest obstacles she has to overcome. But then she remembers why she started. Not for glory. Not for recognition. Not because she wanted people to call her a hero. She started because she loved her home. That simple realization brings her back to the reason behind everything. And suddenly, the journey feels different. She isn't trying to prove that she is special. She is simply trying to do what she believes is right. That is what makes her a leader. A leader isn't someone who is always certain. A leader is someone who keeps moving even when certainty is impossible. The same idea applies to Maui. His greatest challenge isn't defeating another powerful enemy. It's understanding that his value doesn't depend on whether everyone remembers his name. For someone like Maui, that is an incredibly difficult lesson. He has spent so long trying to become a legend that he has forgotten how to simply be himself. Moana helps him understand that being remembered isn't the same thing as being meaningful. What matters is what you do for other people. And Maui eventually begins to understand that. His relationship with Moana therefore becomes more than a simple hero and sidekick partnership. They become equals. Moana may not have Maui's supernatural abilities, but she has something he doesn't always have: clarity about why she is fighting. Maui may not always know what the right decision is, but he has experience that can keep Moana alive when things become dangerous. Together, they balance each other. The story also continues to emphasize the importance of Moana's connection to her ancestors. Her journey isn't only about discovering the world outside Motunui. It is about rediscovering a part of her people's identity. The people of Motunui once had a stronger relationship with the ocean and with exploration. Over time, fear caused that tradition to disappear. Moana's journey begins to restore that connection. That gives her adventure a much bigger meaning. She isn't simply changing her own future. She is changing the future of her entire community. And that is why returning home becomes so important. Moana doesn't want to come back as someone who escaped. She wants to come back as someone who discovered something. She wants her people to understand that the ocean isn't simply a threat waiting to destroy them. It can also be a path toward a larger world. That idea is central to the identity of the story. The ocean doesn't separate Moana from her people. It connects them. And the more she learns, the more she realizes that her ancestors understood this long before she was born. The live-action film has the opportunity to make that realization visually powerful. Instead of simply showing an animated ocean, the filmmakers can use enormous landscapes and sweeping shots to make the audience feel the scale of the world Moana is rediscovering. That sense of scale is one of the biggest advantages a live-action adaptation can offer. The horizon feels endless, the islands feel distant, the storms feel dangerous, and Moana herself feels small compared with the world she has entered. Yet she keeps going. That contrast is what makes the adventure feel heroic. There is also something important about the way Moana interacts with the ocean itself. She doesn't control it. She doesn't command it. She learns to work with it. That's another reflection of her personality. Moana doesn't become powerful by controlling everything around her. She becomes powerful by learning how to understand the world around her. This is very different from Maui. Maui's instinct is often to control the situation. Moana's instinct eventually becomes adaptation. And when the two approaches collide, Moana often discovers that flexibility is more useful than raw strength. That lesson becomes essential as the story approaches its climax. The dangers become larger. The decisions become more serious. And there is no longer enough time to hesitate. Moana has to trust everything she has learned. She has to trust Maui. She has to trust the ocean. And most importantly, she has to trust herself. This is the point where her character comes full circle. At the beginning, she wanted someone else to tell her what the ocean was calling her toward. By the end, she understands that the answer was never going to come from another person. She had to discover it herself. That is why the story resonates so strongly. The adventure may involve magical powers, mythical creatures, and legendary demigods, but the emotional journey is incredibly human. Everyone has moments when they feel like they don't belong. Everyone has moments when they wonder whether they are capable of becoming the person others expect them to be. And everyone eventually has to decide whether to stay inside their comfort zone or take a step into uncertainty. Moana takes that step, and once she does, there is no going back. Her journey has also changed Maui. The demigod who once cared deeply about being admired now has someone he genuinely wants to protect. That is a major transformation. He begins the story wanting recognition. He ends up discovering something more meaningful than recognition. Connection. Friendship. Purpose. And Moana experiences a similar transformation. She begins the journey wanting to discover what is beyond the reef. She ends up discovering what is inside herself. That is the real destination. The island she wanted to save was always important, but the person she needed to become was just as important. The final stage of the story, therefore, isn't simply about defeating whatever stands in her way. It's about proving that everything she has learned has changed her. She doesn't need to become Maui. She doesn't need to become her father. She doesn't need to become another legendary hero. She needs to become a Moai in a dot, and once she understands that, the fear that once controlled her begins to lose its power. The ocean is still enormous. The future is still uncertain. The dangers are still real. But Moana is no longer standing at the edge of the reef wondering whether she belongs there. She knows she does. And now she is ready to face whatever is waiting beyond the horizon. That is where the story reaches one of its most important emotional turning points. Moana finally understands that the journey wasn't about finding permission to become a wayfinder. She had been one all along. She simply needed the courage to accept it. And as she prepares for the final challenge, the bond between Moana and Maui becomes stronger than ever. They have argued, they have failed, they have doubted each other, but they have also learned how to trust one another. Now they have one final opportunity to prove that everything they have learned actually means something. The journey that began with one girl looking toward the ocean has become something much larger. It has become a story about family, identity, courage, tradition, friendship, and the courage to imagine a different future. And as the waves rise and the final challenge approaches, Moana is finally ready. Not because she knows exactly what will happen, but because she has learned something far more important. She doesn't need to know the entire path before taking the next step. She only needs to trust that she can find her way. Moana has reached the point where there is no turning back. Everything she has learned since leaving Motunui is now being put to the test. The ocean that once seemed like an impossible mystery has become familiar to her, but that doesn't make it any less dangerous. If anything, understanding the ocean has made her realize just how powerful it really is. She knows that one wrong decision could put everyone in danger, but this time, she isn't facing that fear as the same uncertain girl who first stepped into the canoe. She has experience now. She has failed before. She has been afraid before. And she has discovered that failure doesn't automatically mean the end of the journey. Sometimes it simply means you have to find another way forward. Maui is also beginning to understand that this journey has changed him. At first, he treated Moana like someone who needed his protection. He assumed that because he was a demigod, he automatically knew what was best. But after everything they have experienced together, that attitude no longer works. Moana has earned his respect, and more importantly, she has earned his trust. That makes their final push toward the goal much more meaningful because they are no longer working together simply because they have no other choice. They are doing it because they genuinely believe in each other. Maui's role in the story has always been complicated. He is powerful, but his greatest weakness is his pride. He wants to be remembered as a hero, and sometimes that desire causes him to make decisions without thinking about the consequences. Moana has slowly forced him to look beyond that image. She doesn't care how impressive the stories about Maui are. She cares about what he does when things become difficult. And that is something Maui finally understands. Being a hero isn't about having the strongest weapon or the biggest reputation. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice when someone else needs you. That realization changes the way he approaches the final challenge. Instead of thinking about how he can prove himself, Maui starts thinking about how he can help Moana succeed. And Moana is doing something similar. She isn't trying to become a legend. She isn't trying to make her name famous. She is thinking about Motunui. She is thinking about her family. She is thinking about the people who trusted her enough to let her go. That responsibility gives her strength, but it also makes the danger feel much more serious, because now she understands what failure would mean. It wouldn't simply be an unsuccessful adventure. It could mean returning home without the future she promised to find. For someone who has spent the entire journey learning to trust herself, this is the moment when doubt could easily return. And for a brief moment, it does. Moana begins questioning whether she is actually capable of finishing what she started. She remembers the times when she made mistakes. She remembers moments when Maui didn't believe in her. She remembers the times when the ocean seemed to be working against her. All those memories come rushing back. But then she remembers something even more important. Every time she thought she couldn't continue, she found another reason to move forward. That has always been her greatest strength. Not perfection. Persistence. Moana doesn't succeed because she always knows the right answer. She succeeds because she refuses to stop searching for one. That is what makes her different from the people who came before her. She is willing to question what everyone else accepted as impossible. And that willingness is exactly what allows her to see a solution that others may have missed. As the final challenge approaches, the ocean becomes more intense. The waves rise around them, the boat struggles against the current, and the distance between Mona and her goal seems almost impossible to overcome. Maui tries to take control. Mona stops him. This time, she understands something he doesn't. They cannot fight the ocean. They have to work with it. That lesson represents everything Mona has learned throughout the journey. At the beginning, she wanted the ocean to give her answers. Now she understands that the ocean doesn't need to explain itself. She has to learn how to listen. And once she does, the path ahead becomes clearer. Maui watches her make the decision. For once, he doesn't argue. He trusts her. That small moment says more about their friendship than any dramatic speech could. The Demigod who once believed he had to lead everything is finally willing to step aside and let Mona lead. And Mona, who once believed she needed Maui to guide her, finally understands that she has become capable of guiding both of them. This is the moment when their relationship becomes equal. Not because Mona has become as powerful as Maui, and not because Maui has lost his abilities, but because they finally understand that strength can come in different forms. Maui has supernatural power. Mona has determination and understanding. Together, those strengths become much more powerful than either one alone. The final confrontation, therefore, isn't simply about physical strength. It is about everything they have learned. Maui has to overcome his pride. Mona has to overcome her fear. And both of them have to trust the other person completely. As the danger reaches its highest point, Mona makes the kind of decision that would have terrified her at the beginning of the story. She takes the risk, not because she knows it will work, but because she knows doing nothing will guarantee failure. That is the difference between the Mona we met at the beginning and the person standing here now. She has finally accepted that courage doesn't come with certainty. Sometimes you have to act without knowing what happens next. The ocean responds to her determination, and the entire journey seems to come together in one final movement. Everything she learned about navigation, everything Maui taught her, everything her grandmother told her, everything she discovered about her ancestors, all of it has led to this moment. And suddenly, the journey feels much bigger than one mission. Mona is proving something to herself. She is proving that her instincts were never a weakness. The voice inside her that told her there was more beyond the reef wasn't asking her to abandon her home. It was asking her to understand it. And now she finally does. The world beyond Motunui didn't make her forget where she came from. It made her appreciate it more. That is one of the most beautiful ideas in the story. Leaving home doesn't always mean leaving your past behind. Sometimes you have to travel far away to understand where you truly belong. Mona has traveled across the ocean, faced impossible dangers, and stood beside a demigod, but the person she was searching for throughout the journey was herself. And now she has found her. Maui sees that transformation. The Mona standing beside him isn't the uncertain girl he met at the beginning. She is a wayfinder, a leader, someone who can make decisions even when everyone else is afraid. And Maui knows that when they return to Motunui, things will never be exactly the same. Mona won't either. She will return with knowledge her people haven't had for generations. She will bring back a new understanding of the ocean. And perhaps most importantly, she will bring back the confidence to show her people that their future doesn't have to be limited by their fears. The journey has taught her that tradition and progress don't have to be enemies. You can respect where you came from while still discovering where you want to go. That balance is what makes Mona's story so powerful. She doesn't destroy the old way. She expands it. And that is exactly what a true leader should do. As the final moments of the adventure approach, the tension begins to give way to something else. Hope. For the first time, Mona can look toward the horizon without seeing it as something frightening. She sees possibilities, new islands. New journeys, new stories, and a future that her people can build together. Maui also stands beside her. No longer simply the legendary demigod who wanted everyone to admire him. He is now someone who has found a purpose beyond his reputation. Their friendship has changed both of them, and that is why their journey matters. They didn't simply help each other complete a mission. They helped each other understand who they were. When Mona finally looks back toward Motunui, the island feels different. Not because the island has changed, because she has. The same shore that once felt like the boundary of her world now feels like the beginning of something much larger. She knows there is still more to discover. And for the first time, she isn't afraid of that. She is ready to return, ready to lead, and ready to sail again whenever the ocean calls. But before she can think about the future, there is one final thing she has to do. She has to go home, because every great journey eventually leads back to the place where it began. And when Mona finally returns to Motunui, The people waiting for her aren't simply seeing the girl who left. They are seeing the person she became, a wayfinder who crossed the ocean, a daughter who found her own path, and a leader who discovered that sometimes the greatest responsibility is having the courage to imagine a future nobody else can see. That is the real journey Mona has been on from the very beginning. Not simply across the ocean. The journey back to Motunui should feel like a victory, but for Mona, it is also the beginning of something completely new. She has spent so much time thinking about reaching her destination that she hasn't had much time to consider what happens afterward. Now the ocean is behind her, the immediate danger has passed, and she finally has a chance to look at everything that has changed. The first thing she realizes is that she doesn't feel like the same person who left. When Mona originally stepped onto the boat, she was carrying uncertainty with her. She wanted to prove that she could help her people, but deep down she was still searching for permission to follow the voice inside her. She wanted someone to tell her that she was making the right choice. Now she doesn't need that permission anymore. She knows. She understands why she had to leave, and more importantly, she understands why she has to return. Motunui is still her home, but now she sees it differently. Before the journey, the island felt like a boundary. It was the place beyond which she wasn't supposed to go. After everything she has experienced, that same island feels like a starting point. The difference isn't the island. The difference is Mona. That is one of the most satisfying parts of her character development. The story doesn't suggest that home was the problem. It shows that Mona needed to leave home in order to understand it. And when she finally approaches Motunui, the emotional weight of the moment becomes clear. Her family has been waiting. Her people have been waiting. And Mona has returned with something much more valuable than a simple victory. She has returned with knowledge. She now understands the ocean in a way that her community had forgotten. She knows that their ancestors were voyagers. She understands that the world is much larger than the boundaries they created around themselves. And she wants to share that knowledge. Chief Tui has one of the most emotional reactions because he has spent much of the story afraid that the ocean would take his daughter away from him. His fear was never really about the water. It was about losing Mona. But now he sees that the journey didn't destroy the person she was. It helped her become who she was always meant to be. For a father who wanted to protect his daughter, that realization is incredibly powerful. He doesn't have to agree with every decision Mona makes. He doesn't have to stop worrying about her. He simply has to trust her, and that is something Mona has earned. Sina's reaction is different but equally emotional. She understands how much courage it took for Mona to leave and how much uncertainty she faced along the way. For her mother, seeing Mona return isn't just about seeing her daughter alive and safe. It's about seeing her daughter confident. The girl who once questioned whether she belonged beyond the reef now returns knowing exactly where she belongs. Grandma Tala's influence can be felt throughout the entire journey as well. Even though her guidance came earlier, Mona carries her grandmother's words with her. Tla taught her that the ocean wasn't something she should fear. She taught her that listening to her instincts didn't make her reckless. And she taught her that sometimes the path forward begins with simply trusting the feeling inside you. Mona finally understands the meaning behind those lessons. She also understands that honoring her grandmother doesn't mean living in the past. It means carrying the wisdom of the past into the future. That is why Mona's return feels more like a beginning than an ending. The people of Motunui have a decision to make. Do they continue living within the limits they created, or do they once again become voyagers? Mona has already answered that question for herself. She wants to explore. She wants to discover. She wants her people to reconnect with the ocean. And now she has the experience to guide them. This is where the idea of leadership becomes complete. Earlier, Mona thought being a leader meant protecting everyone from danger. Now she understands that leadership can also mean showing people possibilities they were too afraid to imagine. She doesn't force them to follow her. She inspires them to consider something different. That is a much stronger form of leadership. And this is also where the story's connection to Maui becomes important. Maui has spent his entire existence trying to become a legend. Mona has spent her journey trying to understand who she really is. In the end, both characters discovered that identity isn't something other people can give you. You create it through your choices. Maui doesn't need everyone to call him a hero anymore. Mona doesn't need everyone to tell her that she's a great wayfinder. They know who they are because of what they have done. Their friendship therefore becomes one of the most meaningful parts of the entire story. Maui may eventually leave, But the relationship they built doesn't disappear. They changed each other. Moana helped Maui become more honest with himself. Maui helped Moana become more confident in her abilities. Neither character could have completed the journey exactly the same way without the other. That is what makes their partnership work. It isn't based on similarity. It is based on balance. And that idea connects perfectly with the larger message of the movie. Different strengths can work together. Different generations can learn from each other. Tradition can exist alongside change, and fear doesn't have to control the future. The visual presentation of Motu Nui also becomes especially important during these final moments. After spending so much time surrounded by open ocean, returning to the island gives the audience a sense of warmth and familiarity. The village is no longer just the place Moana wanted to escape. It becomes the place she wants to help. That emotional shift is what completes her journey. And then there is the question of what comes next. Moana now knows that the world is much larger than she once believed. There are other islands. Other people. Other oceans. Other stories waiting to be discovered. And that creates a feeling that her journey isn't really finished. If anything, it has only begun. The live-action movie's position as a reimagining of the original story makes this especially interesting. Disney isn't presenting this as an entirely separate adventure with a brand new mythology. Instead, it is taking the familiar story and presenting it through live action, with a new cast and a different visual language. Movies.disney.com. That means the ending carries the same emotional foundation audiences already know, but the physical performances and live-action environment give those moments a new texture. The ocean doesn't just look like an animated painting anymore. The island doesn't feel like a purely fictional backdrop. The characters have physical presence, and that changes the emotional experience. The movie's music also contributes to that feeling. When the familiar melodies return, they bring back memories of the animated film, but the new performances give them a slightly different emotional quality. For longtime fans, that can be both nostalgic and refreshing. For new viewers, the songs simply become part of Moana's story, and that is probably the best way to approach this movie. Don't watch it expecting it to erase the original. Watch it as another interpretation of a story that already meant something to millions of people. The original Moana will always have its own identity. The 2026 version doesn't need to replace it. It simply needs to create its own emotional connection. And that is where Catherine Laga'aie's performance becomes particularly important. Her Moana has to carry the entire emotional journey. She has to begin as someone who is uncertain about her place in the world and end as someone who knows exactly who she is. That transformation is the backbone of the movie. Without it, the adventure would simply be a collection of beautiful locations and exciting scenes. With it, the adventure has meaning. And the same is true for Maui. Dwayne Johnson's performance has to make Maui entertaining enough to keep the lighter moments alive while also allowing the audience to understand the insecurity beneath the confidence. The combination of those two performances gives the movie its emotional center. Moana and Maui aren't perfect. That's why we care about them. They make mistakes. They argue. They get frustrated. They sometimes misunderstand each other. But they keep choosing to help one another. And that choice becomes more important than any individual victory. By the end, Moana has learned something that many people spend their entire lives trying to understand. You don't always need to know exactly where you're going. Sometimes you simply need enough courage to take the next step. The ocean taught her that. Her grandmother taught her that. Maui taught her that in his own strange way. And her family taught her something else. No matter how far you travel, you can still have a place to return to. That is what makes the final return to Motu Nui so emotional. Moana isn't coming home because she failed. She's coming home because she succeeded. But success didn't mean becoming someone completely different. It meant becoming more fully herself. And as she stands among her people, she finally understands that her journey was never about escaping the island. It was about opening the island's world to something bigger. The horizon that once looked like a wall now looks like an invitation. And Moana is ready to answer it. The story closes with a sense of possibility. There is still an entire ocean out there. There are still places nobody from Motu Nui has seen. There are still lessons waiting to be learned. And there is still a future that Moana can help shape. That is why the ending doesn't feel like a traditional final chapter. It feels like the first page of a much larger story. Moana has found her voice. What makes Moana's journey even more interesting at this stage is that her biggest victory isn't something that can be measured by a single battle or a dramatic moment. The real victory is the change she has created in the way she sees herself and the way her people see their future. Before she left Motunui, the idea of exploring the ocean seemed almost impossible. Now, after everything she has experienced, that same ocean represents opportunity. But returning home doesn't mean every problem disappears. In fact, Moana quickly discovers that changing people's minds can be harder than surviving a dangerous journey. Her experience has given her confidence, but the people around her haven't experienced what she has. They haven't seen the islands beyond the reef. They haven't faced the storms. They haven't watched Maui use his powers. They haven't felt the danger that Moana survived. For them, the ocean is still the unknown. And the unknown is frightening. Moana understands that now. Earlier in her life, she might have become frustrated and demanded that everyone simply believe her. But the journey has taught her patience. She realizes that leadership isn't about forcing people to see things the way you do. Sometimes you have to show them. That becomes one of the most important developments in her character. Moana starts thinking less like someone who has just returned from an adventure and more like someone who is responsible for building a future. She understands that one successful voyage isn't enough. If Motunui is going to reconnect with the ocean, her people need to learn how to navigate again. They need to understand the stars, the currents, the winds, and the signs that their ancestors once used. The knowledge cannot remain inside a Moa, and it has to become part of the community. And that is where the idea of legacy becomes even more powerful. Moana's ancestors left behind a tradition that was almost forgotten. She has now rediscovered it, but she doesn't want to keep it locked in the past. She wants the next generation to inherit it. In a way, that means Moana becomes the bridge between two worlds. She understands the traditions of the past, but she has also experienced the possibilities of the future, and she realizes that both can exist together. This is one of the reasons the story's cultural setting matters so much. The ocean isn't simply a beautiful location for an adventure. It represents history, identity, connection, and movement. The people of Motunui are connected to it whether they choose to acknowledge that connection or not. Moana's role is to help them remember. And this time, she doesn't have to do it alone. The people who once worried about her are beginning to understand what she has accomplished. Chief Tui, especially, has to confront the fear that influenced many of his decisions. He wanted to protect Moana because he knew how dangerous the ocean could be, but in trying to protect her, he almost prevented her from becoming the person who could help everyone. That is a difficult realization for any parent. Sometimes protecting someone means keeping them safe. Other times, protecting them means giving them enough freedom to discover what they are capable of. Tui eventually understands the difference, and that creates a new relationship between father and daughter. Moana no longer needs her father's approval to make every decision, but she still values his advice. That's an important distinction. Growing up doesn't mean rejecting your family. It means learning how to stand beside them as an equal. Sina sees that change too. Her daughter is still the same person she loves, but there is now a confidence in her that wasn't there before. Moana doesn't hesitate when she talks about the ocean. She doesn't look away when someone questions her. She doesn't apologize for wanting more. She has finally accepted that her curiosity is part of who she is, and that acceptance changes everything. The same can be said about Maui. His journey doesn't simply end because Moana returns home. He has his own identity to deal with. For centuries, Maui has been defined by his legends. People tell stories about his incredible strength, his magical fishhook, and the great things he accomplished. But after traveling with Moana, he begins to understand that legends are only part of a person's story. What matters more is what happens when nobody is telling the story. Maui doesn't need to constantly perform for an audience anymore. He can simply be himself. That doesn't mean he suddenly becomes quiet or serious. He's still Maui. He's still confident. He's still dramatic. He's still going to remind everyone that he is a demigod whenever he gets the chance. But there is now a difference in the way he carries that confidence. It feels less like insecurity disguised as arrogance, and more like genuine self-acceptance. Moana helped him reach that point without even realizing it. That's the beauty of their relationship. Neither character sets out to fix the other. They simply spend enough time together to expose the parts of themselves they were hiding. Maui teaches Moana to survive the world outside her home. Moana teaches Maui that being needed is more important than being admired. Their friendship works because both of them give something valuable to the other. And when Maui eventually continues his own journey, Mona is no longer worried that she will lose the person who helped her. She knows that what they experience together will stay with her. That's what real friendship looks like. You don't have to remain together every second for the connection to matter. Sometimes someone enters your life for a short period and changes the direction of your entire future. Maui is that person for Moana and Mona is that person for Maui. There is also something satisfying about seeing Mona interact with the younger members of her community. She is no longer simply the girl who wanted to know what was beyond the reef. Now there are children who look at her and see someone who went there. Someone who discovered what existed beyond their small world. And that creates a new responsibility. Mona has become an example. She has to be careful about what kind of example she becomes. She doesn't want future generations to believe that they have to leave home to be important. She wants them to understand that they can explore because they are curious, while still knowing where they came from. That's a much healthier idea of adventure. Exploration isn't about rejecting your identity. It's about expanding it. And that message is especially powerful for a story centered around a young woman discovering her own independence. Mona doesn't need to choose between family and freedom. She learns that she can have both. She can love Motunui and still sail beyond it. She can respect her father and still disagree with him. She can honor her ancestors and still create something new. She can listen to tradition without allowing fear to control her future. That balance is ultimately what makes her a strong leader. As the story settles after the major adventure, the tone becomes more reflective. The danger has passed, but the lessons remain. Mona looks at the ocean differently now. Before, she saw it as something calling her. Now, she sees it as something connected to her identity. It isn't simply a destination. It's part of who she is. And perhaps that is why the final image of the horizon carries so much meaning. The horizon is still there. It hasn't changed. What has changed is Mona's relationship with it. She no longer sees it as a boundary. She sees it as a possibility. That small difference represents her entire character arc. At the beginning, the horizon represented something forbidden. In the middle, it represented danger. By the end, it represents freedom. And that is exactly how growth works. The world doesn't necessarily become less frightening. You become more prepared to face it. Mona has learned that fear doesn't disappear simply because you become brave. Sometimes you feel the fear and move anyway. That is what she did when she first left Motunui. That's what she did when she faced Maui. That's what she did when the journey seemed impossible. And that's what she will continue doing in the future. The story therefore leaves Mona in a very different place from where it found her. She started as someone searching for an answer. She ends as someone capable of finding her own answers. She started by asking whether she belonged on the ocean. She ends knowing that she does. She started by worrying about what others expected from her. She ends understanding what she expects from herself. And perhaps the most important change is that she no longer needs to prove that she is worthy. Her actions have already answered that question. This is also why the live-action adaptation has a difficult responsibility. Audiences already know Mona's journey. They know many of the emotional beats. They know the characters. So the movie has to make those familiar moments feel sincere. It has to remind viewers why they cared about Mona in the first place. The spectacle can attract people to the theater. The performances can keep them watching. The music can bring back nostalgia. But the emotional truth of the story is what makes people remember it. And that emotional truth is surprisingly simple. A young woman feels that there is more to her life than the path chosen for her. She is afraid to follow that feeling. She goes anyway. She makes mistakes. She meets someone who challenges her. She discovers that the world is larger than she imagined. And eventually, she discovers that she is stronger than she believed. That's why Mona continues to connect with audiences. The mythology may be specific to its world, but the emotional journey is universal. Everyone has a horizon. Everyone has something they are afraid to cross. And everyone eventually reaches a moment when they have to decide whether they will stay where they are or take the next step. By the time Mona reaches this stage of her journey, she has already proven that she can survive the ocean, but survival was never the final goal. The deeper purpose of her journey was to understand what her people had lost and what she could do to help them move forward. Now that she has returned home, she begins to realize that bringing back knowledge is only the first step. The harder challenge is turning that knowledge into a new future. For Mona, this means becoming more than a traveler. She has to become a teacher. She has to become someone who can guide others across the ocean. And most importantly, she has to become comfortable with the idea that people are now looking to her for answers. That responsibility is very different from the one she imagined at the beginning. Before leaving Motunui, she thought being a leader meant protecting everyone from danger. She believed that if she could keep the island safe, she would be doing her job. But after everything she has experienced, she understands that safety without growth can eventually become another kind of danger. If people are too afraid to explore, they can lose important parts of their history. If they refuse to change, they can become trapped by the limitations created by fear. Moana doesn't want that for Motunui. She wants her people to remember who they were. The ancient voyagers who came before them weren't reckless explorers sailing into the unknown without purpose. They were skilled navigators who understood the ocean and knew how to read the world around them. That history becomes a source of pride for Moana, and she wants the people of Motunui to feel that pride too. This gives her return a deeper meaning. She isn't bringing back treasure. She isn't bringing back some magical object that will solve every problem. She is bringing back knowledge. And knowledge is something that can be passed from one generation to another. That makes it much more valuable. The younger members of the community begin to see the ocean differently because of Moana. Where they once saw danger, they begin to see possibility. Where they once saw an endless empty horizon, they begin to see roads leading somewhere. And that is perhaps Moana's greatest achievement. She changes the way people imagine their future. This is also where her relationship with Chief Tui reaches its most important point. For much of Moana's life, her father has tried to keep her close, because he believes the island is the safest place for her. He doesn't understand why she keeps looking toward the ocean. To him, that curiosity is a threat. But now he has seen what that curiosity accomplished. He understands that the thing he feared most was also the thing that gave Moana the ability to help everyone. That doesn't mean he suddenly stops worrying. He is still her father. He will probably always worry when she sails into dangerous waters. But now his fear doesn't control his decisions. He has learned to trust his daughter, and Moana has learned that trust doesn't mean never disagreeing. It means respecting each other's choices. That is a much healthier relationship. Sina also becomes part of that new balance. She has always supported Moana's instincts, but now she gets to see her daughter use those instincts responsibly. Moana isn't simply following a feeling anymore. She understands how to turn that feeling into action. That is a huge difference. It shows how much she has grown. She can now think about consequences. She can listen to advice without automatically surrendering her own judgment, and she can accept responsibility when something goes wrong. Those are the qualities that make her a leader. Not the title, not the legend, not the fact that the ocean chose her. Her choices are what make her worthy of leadership. The same idea applies to Maui. Even though he is not a member of Moana's community, his influence on her journey remains important. Maui introduced her to the dangers of the world beyond Motunui. He taught her practical skills. He challenged her assumptions. And, perhaps most importantly, he forced her to become more confident. But Moana also gave Maui something he had been missing for a very long time. A relationship that wasn't based on admiration. She didn't care whether he was famous. She didn't need him to impress her. She simply needed him to be honest and useful. That sounds simple, but for Maui, it was transformative. He spent much of his existence trying to convince people that he was a hero. Moana never needed convincing. She judged him by what he did. That forced him to confront the difference between being called a hero and actually acting like one. And eventually, he learns that the second one matters much more. His journey therefore mirrors Moana's. She has to stop trying to become the person everyone expects. He has to stop trying to become the person everyone remembers. Both of them have to accept themselves. That parallel makes their friendship much stronger. They are different, but they understand each other because they are both struggling with identity. One is trying to discover who she is. The other is trying to remember who he was before the legend took over. Together, they find the answer. The answer isn't fame. It isn't power. It isn't approval. It's purpose. And that is one of the strongest themes running through the entire story. Purpose gives Moana the courage to sail. Purpose gives Maui the courage to change. Purpose gives Motunui a reason to look beyond the reef. The ocean therefore becomes more than a setting. It becomes a symbol of possibility. Every wave carries the memory of the people who came before. Every horizon suggests another destination. Every journey offers another opportunity to learn. And for Moana, the ocean is now part of her identity. She doesn't have to choose between being a daughter of Motunui and being a wayfinder. She is both. That's an important message because growing up often feels like choosing between different versions of yourself. Your family may have one idea of who you should become. Your friends may have another. Society may have another. But eventually, you have to decide which parts of those expectations actually belong to you. Moana does exactly that. She keeps the love. She keeps the traditions. She keeps the lessons. But she leaves behind the fear. That is what allows her to move forward. And when the people of Motunui begin preparing to explore again, Moana's role becomes even clearer. She isn't simply the person who discovered the path. She becomes the person who can teach others how to follow it. The younger generation will learn from her. The community will regain a skill that was almost forgotten. And the island will no longer feel like the edge of the world. It will become one point in a much larger network of islands and communities. That idea makes the ending feel hopeful. The story doesn't suggest that the world has suddenly become safe. The ocean will still be dangerous. Storms will still come. People will still make mistakes. But now Motunui will face those challenges with knowledge instead of fear. And that is a huge transformation. Moana has essentially changed the culture of her home by changing herself first. She didn't force anyone to follow her. She simply showed them what was possible. That's the kind of leadership that lasts. And this is where the live-action version has another opportunity to create a powerful emotional payoff. Seeing the community preparing boats, learning navigation, and looking toward the ocean together can make the final message feel larger than Moana's personal story. Her journey has become everyone's journey. Her discovery has become their discovery. And the future she imagined for herself has become a future the entire community can share. The movie's broader themes also connect strongly with the Pacific setting and the film's emphasis on voyaging traditions. Disney has highlighted the Pacific cultural influence behind the project and the involvement of Pacific cast members and filmmakers. The Walt Disney Company.com That cultural connection is important because it gives the story a sense of identity beyond the fantasy elements. Moana isn't simply a generic hero who happens to live on an island. Her relationship with the ocean is part of her people's history. Her journey is connected to generations of people who traveled across the Pacific. And her decision to continue that tradition feels like an act of remembering. The movie therefore becomes partly about rediscovery. Not discovering something that never existed, discovering something that was forgotten. That is why the return home matters so much. Moana doesn't come back with a completely new identity. She comes back understanding the identity she already had. And that may be the most important lesson of the entire story. Sometimes you don't discover yourself by becoming someone new. Sometimes you discover yourself by understanding the person you already were. Moana always had curiosity. She always cared about her people. She always felt connected to the ocean. The journey simply gave her the courage to accept those parts of herself. And once she does, everything starts to make sense. Her family understands her better. Her community trusts her. Maui respects her. And she finally trusts herself. That is a powerful place to leave the character. But the ocean is still there. The horizon is still waiting. And Moana knows that one journey is never really the end for a wayfinder. There will always be another island, another challenge. Another lesson. Another horizon. And now, instead of fearing what lies beyond it, she looks forward to discovering it. That is what makes the ending feel hopeful rather than final. Moana's story has reached one destination, but her life has opened into countless possibilities. She has gone from a girl who was afraid to cross the reef to a leader who can guide an entire community across the ocean. What makes Moana's story stay with the audience is that her journey doesn't end when the biggest danger is gone. In many adventure stories, once the hero defeats the final threat, everything immediately feels complete. But Moana's story works differently. The real reward isn't a trophy or a title. It's the understanding she brings back with her, and that understanding continues to change the way she looks at her home, her family, and the ocean. Before her journey, Moana believed that the safest way to protect Motunui was to stay close to it. The island was everything she knew, and her father's warnings made the ocean feel like a dangerous place that could take everything away from them. But after traveling beyond the reef, Moana discovers that the ocean was never simply something to fear. It was part of her people's identity. That discovery changes the meaning of home. Home is no longer a place surrounded by limits. It becomes a place with a history. And Moana now understands that history in a way she never could before. She realizes that her ancestors weren't afraid of the ocean. They understood it. They traveled across it. They used the stars, winds, currents, and natural signs to navigate enormous distances. At some point, that knowledge was lost. Fear replaced curiosity. The people stopped traveling, and eventually, the ocean became something mysterious again. Mona's journey breaks that cycle. She doesn't simply rediscover an old tradition, she proves that it can still work. And that is why the people of Motunui begin to look at her differently. She isn't just the chief's daughter anymore. She is someone who has brought back a part of their identity. That creates a new kind of responsibility. Mona now has to think beyond herself. When she was younger, she wanted to explore because she felt drawn toward the ocean. Now she has to think about what happens when other people follow her. What if someone isn't ready? What if someone makes a mistake? What if the ocean becomes dangerous? Those questions force Mona to understand that leadership doesn't mean encouraging people to take risks without thinking. It means teaching them how to take those risks responsibly. That is a much more mature understanding of exploration. And it is exactly the kind of lesson Mona has learned through her own mistakes. She knows what happens when you underestimate the ocean. She knows what happens when you let pride control a decision. She knows how quickly a small problem can become a major disaster. Now she can use those experiences to protect others. In that sense, every mistake she made becomes valuable. Nothing was wasted. Every failure became a lesson. Every moment of fear became experience. Every disagreement with Maui helped her understand how to deal with people who think differently from her. And every conversation with her family helped her understand the balance between independence and responsibility. That's what makes her transformation feel earned. She didn't become a leader because the story suddenly decided she was one. She became a leader because she went through the process of becoming one. Maui's transformation follows a similar path. At first, he is obsessed with his reputation. He wants people to remember his name. He wants everyone to know about his accomplishments. He wants to be the legendary Maui from the stories. But Mona slowly makes him realize that there is a difference between being remembered and being meaningful. A person can have hundreds of stories told about them and still feel completely alone. Maui's problem isn't that people don't know who he is. His problem is that he doesn't know who he is without the stories. That is why his friendship with Mona matters so much. She doesn't care about the legend. She cares about the person. She sees the insecurity underneath his confidence. She sees that he is afraid of failing. She sees that he wants to be accepted. And instead of making fun of those weaknesses, she challenges him to face them. That is something Maui desperately needs. For the first time, he has someone who won't simply praise him or fear him. Mona expects him to be better, and because he respects her, he starts trying. That is why their friendship feels stronger toward the end of the journey. They don't become close because they are similar. They become close because they challenge each other. Mona teaches Maui humility. Maui teaches Mona confidence. Mona teaches Maui that he doesn't have to constantly prove himself. Maui teaches Mona that she is capable of handling challenges far beyond what she imagined. Both characters become better because of the relationship, and that is one of the strongest emotional elements of the story. The ocean also continues to represent this growth. At the beginning, Mona looks at the water and sees something mysterious. Then she sees something dangerous. Later, she sees it as a path. Finally, she sees it as part of herself. That evolution happens naturally because her understanding of the ocean changes as her understanding of herself changes. The world around her isn't necessarily becoming different. She is becoming different, and that is an important distinction. Sometimes when we grow, we think the world has suddenly become easier, but usually, we have simply become more capable of handling it. The storms still exist. The challenges still exist. The uncertainty still exists. What changes is our response. Mona learns how to respond. She doesn't panic every time something goes wrong. She doesn't immediately assume that failure means the journey is over. She adapts. She listens. She thinks. And then she acts. Those qualities are what make her a true wayfinder, not simply her ability to sail. Anyone can follow a route if the route is already known. A wayfinder is someone who can discover a route when there isn't one. Mona has become that person. And that gives the story a deeper meaning than simply follow your dreams. Sometimes following your dreams means accepting responsibility for where those dreams lead. Mona doesn't just want adventure anymore. She understands the consequences of adventure. She understands that her decisions affect other people. And that is why her freedom becomes meaningful. She isn't running away from responsibility. She is accepting more of it. That distinction is crucial. The movie's live-action setting also reinforces this idea because everything feels more physical. The boats, the ocean, the island, and the characters all exist in a world that appears tangible. That makes the journey feel less like a fantasy escape and more like a real expedition into an enormous environment. Of course, the magical elements remain. Maui is still a demigod. The ocean is still extraordinary. The world still contains creatures and forces that don't exist in everyday life. But the physical presentation gives those elements a different weight. The audience can imagine what it would actually feel like to stand on a small boat surrounded by endless water. That sense of scale is one of the biggest opportunities of the live-action adaptation. And when Moana looks toward the horizon feels enormous. It feels like something that could contain endless possibilities. That visual idea connects directly to the character. Moana is small compared with the ocean, but she isn't insignificant. She doesn't need to control the entire world. She only needs to understand her place within it. That is the lesson she eventually learns. She isn't meant to conquer the ocean. She is meant to navigate it. She isn't meant to control her people. She is meant to guide them. She isn't meant to erase tradition. She is meant to carry it forward. And she isn't meant to become someone else. She is meant to become herself. That is why her return to Motunui feels so satisfying. She doesn't come back as a completely different person. She comes back as the person she was always capable of becoming. The community also changes because of her. People who once believed the ocean should be avoided begin to understand that it can be part of their future. Children who never imagined leaving the island begin to dream about distant places. The knowledge that had nearly disappeared starts moving from one generation to the next. And that is perhaps the most important legacy Moana leaves behind. She doesn't simply complete a mission. She changes what people believe is possible. That is the kind of impact that lasts. And this is where the story becomes larger than one young woman's adventure. It becomes a story about generations, about how fear can be inherited, but so can courage. A parent can pass fear to a child. A grandparent can pass wisdom. A child can then take those lessons and create something new. Moana stands at the center of that cycle. She carries the past, she lives in the present, and she creates a path toward the future. That's what makes her such an important character. She isn't rejecting the people who came before her. She is completing something they started. And perhaps that is the greatest form of respect for tradition, not freezing it in place, but allowing it to continue growing. The final feeling of the story is therefore not simply happiness. It is possibility. There is still so much ocean left. There are still places to discover. There are still questions without answers. But Moana no longer sees unanswered questions as something frightening. She sees them as invitations. And that is the biggest change of all. The girl who once stood at the reef asking herself whether she should go now stands on the other side of that decision. She went, she survived, she learned, she returned. And now, when she looks toward the horizon, she doesn't ask whether she is ready. She knows she will never be completely ready. Nobody is. But she also knows something else. You don't have to wait until fear disappears before you move forward. Sometimes you move forward while the fear is still there. And that is exactly what makes you brave. The most interesting thing about Moana at this point is that she no longer needs a huge adventure to prove that she has changed. Her growth can be seen in the smallest decisions she makes. The way she listens to her people, the way she responds when someone disagrees with her, and the way she thinks about the future all show that the girl who once felt trapped between her responsibilities and her dreams has finally found a balance between the two. But becoming a leader doesn't mean everything suddenly becomes easy. If anything, it creates new challenges. When Moana was simply trying to discover what was beyond the reef, the only person she had to convince was herself. Now that people are looking to her for guidance, every decision carries more weight. If she chooses the wrong direction, other people could be affected by it. If she takes a risk, others might follow her into that risk. That means Moana has to learn another important lesson. Confidence doesn't mean believing you're always right. Sometimes confidence means being willing to say, I don't know. That is something she learns through her experiences with Maui. He has always been confident, sometimes far more confident than the situation deserves. He can walk into danger believing that his strength will solve everything. But Moana has seen enough to know that even Maui can be wrong. And instead of allowing his confidence to intimidate her, she learns to challenge him. Their conversations become less about one person leading and the other following. They become discussions between two people who have different experiences. Maui knows things Moana doesn't. Moana sees things Maui sometimes misses. And when they combine those perspectives, they can make better decisions. That is why their friendship becomes so important to the overall story. At first, they seem like complete opposites. Maui is loud, Moana is focused. Maui loves attention. Moana doesn't care about fame. Maui relies on power. Moana relies on understanding. But those differences eventually become their greatest advantage. They don't need to become similar. They simply need to respect what the other person brings to the journey. And that is something Moana has learned to do. She doesn't see Maui as someone who has all the answers anymore. She sees him as a partner. That may sound like a small change, but it completely transforms their relationship. Maui also begins to recognize that Moana's strength isn't something he needs to protect from danger. It's something he needs to respect. He knows that she is capable of making difficult choices. He knows that she can handle herself. And most importantly, he knows that she won't stop moving just because the situation becomes frightening. That quality reminds him of something he may have forgotten about himself. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to keep going despite it. Moana demonstrates that repeatedly. She gets scared. She gets frustrated. She doubts herself. But she continues. And that is why her character feels more human than a traditional perfect hero. She isn't fearless. She's determined. There's a difference. A fearless person might not understand the danger. A determined person understands the danger and chooses to continue anyway. Moana is the second kind. That also makes her relationship with her family more meaningful. When she returns to Motunui, she doesn't suddenly stop being their daughter. She still has moments when she wants advice. She still cares about what her parents think. She still wants her community to accept her choices, but she is no longer dependent on their approval. That is a natural part of growing up. At some point, every person has to move from asking, "What do you want me to become?" to asking, "Who do I want to become?" Moana has reached that point, and she doesn't have to choose between her family and herself. She can carry their love with her while following her own path. That's an important message because the story never portrays independence as abandoning the people you love. Moana leaves because she cares. She explores because she wants to protect her home. She returns because she understands how much home means to her. The journey gives her distance, but that distance gives her perspective. Sometimes you have to step away from something to understand it properly. That's exactly what happens with Motunui. Before the journey, Moana sees the island as a place that limits her. After the journey, she sees it as a place worth protecting and expanding. The island itself hasn't changed. Her understanding of it has. And this becomes one of the strongest ideas running through her entire story. The world doesn't always need to change before you can find your place in it. Sometimes you have to change your perspective. That is what Moana has done. She has learned to look beyond the obvious. When others see the ocean and think of danger, she thinks about possibility. When others see tradition and think of rules, she thinks about the wisdom behind those traditions. When others see leadership as authority, she sees it as responsibility. And when others see failure as an ending, she sees it as information. Every mistake tells her something. Every setback gives her another piece of the puzzle. That mindset makes her incredibly difficult to defeat, not because she cannot fail, but because failure cannot convince her to stop. And this is where the story's emotional message becomes stronger. The ocean isn't simply testing whether Moana can survive. It's testing whether she can keep believing in herself when things don't go according to plan. Anyone can feel confident when everything is working. The real test comes when the plan falls apart. Moana has experienced that. She has been pushed into situations she didn't understand. She has had moments when Maui's confidence made things worse. She has faced dangers she never expected. And every time, she learned something. That is why she is ready for whatever comes next. There is also a sense that Moana's journey has opened a much larger world than she originally imagined. Motunui is only one island. The ocean contains countless others. There are people she has never met, stories she has never heard, and places she cannot even imagine yet. For someone like Moana, that realization isn't frightening anymore. It's exciting. She knows there will always be another horizon, and that means there will always be another opportunity to learn. This is also why the ending doesn't feel like Moana has reached a permanent finish line. She has completed one chapter. She hasn't completed her entire life. The difference is important. Her first journey taught her how to become a wayfinder. The journeys that come afterward will teach her what kind of wayfinder she wants to be. Will she focus only on discovering new places? Will she help reconnect different communities? Will she become the person who teaches the next generation? Those possibilities are left open. And honestly, that makes the world feel bigger. Moana doesn't need every question answered. Some questions are more exciting when they remain open. That's the feeling the horizon represents. You can see it, you can move toward it, but you never completely know what is waiting on the other side. For Moana, that's no longer a reason to stay home. It's a reason to keep going. And perhaps the most beautiful part of her journey is that she doesn't need Maui standing beside her forever to continue. Maui helped her discover her strength. Now she can use that strength on her own. That doesn't make their friendship less important. It makes it stronger. A true friend doesn't make you dependent on them. A true friend helps you become capable of standing on your own. Maui did that for Moana, and Moana did the same for him. They met as two people who believed they needed something from the other. They leave the journey as two people who understand that they can choose to stand beside each other without needing each other to define who they are. That's a much more mature kind of friendship. And as Moana looks toward the ocean once again, the feeling isn't fear. It isn't uncertainty. It's anticipation. She knows the water can be dangerous. She knows storms can appear without warning. She knows there will be moments when she questions herself again. But she also knows that she has faced those moments before. She has survived them, she has learned from them, and she has come out stronger. That's why the horizon feels different now. It isn't calling her because she is incomplete. It's calling her because she is ready to discover more. And maybe that's the biggest lesson Moana has learned throughout everything. You don't explore because you have nothing at home. You explore because there is more of the world to understand. You don't leave your past behind, you carry it with you. You don't become a different person. You become more comfortable with the person you already are. Moana began this journey wondering whether she had a place beyond the reef. Now she understands that she can belong in two worlds at once. She can be connected to Motunui and still belong on the open ocean. She can honor her ancestors and still create a new future. She can listen to her family and still make her own decisions. And she can be afraid while still being brave. That is what makes Moana's journey feel complete. Not because every problem has disappeared. Not because the ocean has become completely safe. Not because she suddenly knows everything. But because she finally understands that she doesn't need to know everything. She only needs the courage to keep finding her way. The further Moana moves into her new life as a wayfinder, the more she realizes that becoming a leader was never going to be about one big moment. It happens gradually, through the choices she makes when nobody is watching, the way she listens to her people, the way she handles disagreement, and the way she responds when something goes wrong all become part of the person she is becoming. There is also something different about Moana now. Before her journey, she was always looking toward the ocean because she felt that something was missing. She didn't know exactly what she was searching for, but she knew that staying in one place forever wasn't enough for her. After everything she has experienced, that feeling has changed. She isn't looking toward the ocean because she wants to escape anymore. She is looking toward it because she understands the connection between exploration and her people's future. That distinction matters. Running away and moving forward can look almost identical from the outside, but emotionally they are completely different. Moana isn't running from Motunui, she is carrying Motunui with her. That becomes especially important when she starts thinking about the people who will follow in her footsteps. She doesn't want future wayfinders to repeat the same mistakes she made. She wants them to understand the ocean before they challenge it. She wants them to respect the environment, understand the currents, recognize the signs in the sky, and, most importantly, understand that being brave doesn't mean being careless. This is where Moana's experiences become useful. Every storm she survived becomes a lesson, every mistake becomes knowledge, every difficult decision becomes something she can teach someone else, and slowly, her personal adventure turns into a legacy. The idea of legacy has always been present in Moana's story, but now she finally understands what it really means. A legacy isn't simply leaving behind a famous name. It is leaving behind something that continues helping people after you're gone. Maui once believed his legacy was his legend. The stories people told about him, the incredible things he had done, the way people remembered his name. But Moana shows him another possibility. A legacy can be the people you helped, the courage you gave someone else, the knowledge you passed on, the person you inspired to become better. Maui may never completely lose his dramatic personality, and honestly, he probably wouldn't be Maui if he did. He can still be arrogant, still make jokes, and still act like the strongest person in the room. But underneath all of that, there is a new understanding. He doesn't need to prove that he matters. He knows that he matters, and that makes him much more comfortable with himself. Mona's influence on him is subtle, but it is one of the most satisfying parts of their relationship. She never gives him some magical solution to his insecurities. She simply refuses to treat him like a perfect legend. She treats him like a person who can make mistakes and learn from them. That kind of honesty is something Maui hasn't always experienced. And in return, Maui gives Mona something she needs just as much. He challenges her. He doesn't always agree with her decisions. He doesn't simply tell her what she wants to hear. Sometimes that frustrates her, but it also makes her stronger, because if everyone around you always agrees with you, you never have to examine your choices. Maui forces Mona to explain herself. He makes her defend her ideas, and over time, that makes her more confident, not blindly confident. Confident that she knows why she believes what she believes. That's an important difference, and it also makes the relationship between them feel much more natural. They aren't friends because they are constantly nice to each other. They are friends because they can argue and still respect each other afterward. That kind of relationship feels much more human. It also gives the story moments of humor even when the larger adventure becomes serious. Maui's personality naturally creates lighter moments, while Mona's more focused personality keeps the story grounded. Their differences create chemistry, and when the story becomes emotionally heavy, those lighter moments become even more important, because without them, the journey could feel overwhelming. The balance between humor, emotion, danger, and adventure is one of the things that keeps the story moving. But underneath all those elements is still the same central idea. Mona is learning how to trust herself. That lesson doesn't end simply because she has returned home. In fact, it becomes more difficult now. When she was alone on the ocean, her decisions affected mainly herself and Maui. Now, her decisions can affect an entire community. That means she has to become comfortable with uncertainty. There will be times when two choices both seem reasonable. There will be times when people disagree. There will be times when she makes a decision and later realizes she could have handled it differently. Leadership means accepting all of that. It means understanding that being responsible doesn't mean being perfect. And Mona is finally mature enough to accept that. She no longer expects herself to know everything. She expects herself to keep learning. That may be the biggest sign of her growth. A person who believes they know everything stops growing. A person who understands how much they still don't know remains curious. And curiosity has always been one of Mona's greatest strengths. The difference now is that her curiosity has direction. She isn't simply wondering what's beyond the horizon. She is thinking about what her people could discover there. She is thinking about what knowledge could be shared. She is thinking about how different communities might reconnect. And she is thinking about what kind of future her generation can build. That makes her ambition feel bigger than personal adventure. She isn't exploring just because she wants excitement. She is exploring because she believes discovery can improve people's lives. And that's a powerful evolution. It also changes the way she thinks about tradition. At one point, Mona might have seen tradition as something that prevented her from moving forward. Now she understands that tradition can be a foundation. The problem isn't tradition itself. The problem is forgetting why the tradition existed in the first place. Her ancestors were navigators because they understood the world around them. Their knowledge helped them survive. Their relationship with the ocean shaped their culture. When that knowledge was forgotten, fear filled the empty space. Mona's role is to replace that fear with understanding. She doesn't have to destroy the old rules. She can examine them. She can ask why they existed. And if circumstances have changed, she can find a better way. That's what real progress looks like. Not rejecting everything that came before, learning from it. This theme also makes Mona's relationship with her father more interesting. Chief Tui represents protection and tradition. Mona represents curiosity and change. At first, those two ideas seem impossible to reconcile, but by the end, they begin to understand each other. Tui learns that protecting Mona doesn't mean keeping her away from the ocean. Mona learns that her father's fear comes from love, not from a desire to control her. Once they understand each other, the conflict becomes much smaller. They can disagree without becoming enemies. And that is another sign of Mona's maturity. She no longer needs every disagreement to have a winner. Sometimes understanding is enough. The same idea applies to her relationship with her community. Not everyone will immediately believe what she believes. Some people will still be afraid. Some may question whether returning to voyaging is worth the risk. Mona doesn't have to force them. She can give them time. She can teach them. She can demonstrate what she knows. And eventually, people can decide for themselves. That approach shows how much she has changed. The younger Mona wanted answers immediately. The older Mona understands that some things take time, and that patience is just as important as courage. This is where the story starts feeling less like a simple adventure and more like a story about growing into responsibility. The ocean remains beautiful. The world remains magical. The journey remains exciting. But now there is a deeper emotional layer underneath everything. Moana is no longer asking, "Who am I?" She is asking, "What can I do with who I am?" That's a much harder question. And the answer isn't something she can discover in one day. She will have to keep learning. She will have to make mistakes. She will have to listen to other people. She will have to change her mind sometimes. And she will have to accept that being a leader means carrying uncertainty. But she is ready for that. Because the ocean has already taught her how to navigate without knowing exactly where every wave will take her. That is almost a perfect metaphor for life. You can prepare. You can study the stars. You can understand the currents. You can plan your route. But you can never control every wave. Something unexpected will always happen. The question is whether you can adjust. Mona can. That's what makes her a wayfinder. And when she eventually looks toward the horizon again, the feeling isn't that she needs to go somewhere to become complete. She is already complete. Now she wants to discover what she can do with that understanding. The ocean is no longer a question mark. It's an open invitation. And Mona is ready to answer. Not because she believes nothing can hurt her. Not because she thinks every journey will end perfectly. But because she understands that the unknown is not automatically something to fear. Sometimes the unknown is where the greatest possibilities are waiting. And that is the lesson Mona carries forward.